Welcome back to In the Word, and we're continuing and finishing up actually Paul's epistles. We'll look at the last two today, Titus and Philemon. Paul's epistles, as you recall, are organized in the New Testament simply by length. So the longest one, Romans, 16 chapters, comes first, and Philemon, one chapter, just 24 verses, comes last. So we'll be finishing up these today. We've been in this group of epistles of Paul that are called the pastoral epistles because they're about pastoral ministry, pastoral qualifications. But as I said, not limited to just vocational pastors, not limited even to elders, but rather it applies to anyone who would aspire toward maturity, and that should be all of us. So let's take a look at Titus, and then we'll go into Philemon. As we said, 1 Timothy was a book, it's kind of a leadership manual. 2 Timothy was a ministry manual. Titus is a church manual. It's what the church should be doing. The background here is Titus was sent by Paul from Europe to Crete. He's dispatched there, and Paul says to put in order to the things that are undone. So he needs to finish establishing the church or churches on Crete, and he tells them to do three things in this letter. He tells them to appoint elders in chapter 1, establish ministries in chapter 2, and focus on evangelism in chapter 3. So let's dig into that a little bit. Number 1, establish elders. Paul repeats a phrase here twice that he's used in 1 Timothy, that elders in terms of qualification are to be above reproach. Now, this doesn't mean that elders are supposed to be sinless men. That's not going to be possible. But it does mean that they are beyond accusation, that they can't be blamed for moral or doctrinal failure by either people inside the church or outside the church. That's what he's meaning by this. The word is very interesting. The word is used outside the Bible quite a bit. To designate, for example, a wife whose husband was trying to divorce her. She's defending herself by saying that she was above reproach in their marriage or blameless, that there's no reason that he should be bringing a suit of divorce. Another instance, a little humorous, was a first century barber. I don't know if he got a bad review on the first century equivalent to TripAdvisor, but he's defending himself against an accusation from a customer that he did a bad job. And he is using this word, above reproach, to say that he's beyond accusation of having done anything wrong. Well, that's the idea here. And it's used in verse 6, and then there's a list of positive things that kind of expands on what above reproach means. It's used again in verse 7, which is followed by a list of negative things that kind of flesh out what is reproachable. And then that's followed in verse 8 by some more positive things. So again, I think these lists are not limiting the definition of above reproach, but giving you some guidance on what above reproach means. So first thing he is supposed to do is establish elders. And what are elders supposed to do? Chapter 1 tells us that they should be not only equipped morally, but doctrinally. They need to be rooted in the faith, it says, and that's a reference to the apostolic teaching. And they need to be able to defend the faith against those who would object to it. I served in a church recently where one of the elders told me that after they were appointed elder, they went to the senior pastor, asked the senior pastor, what am I supposed to do? Can you give me anything that gives me guidance? And the answer was no. Well, that's a tragedy, and that's unbiblical. And elders are to be able to be equipped in order to not only teach sound doctrine, but also to defend it. So elders need to be able to do that. And you, brothers and sisters, need to be made sure that you are led by men who can do that, and that you are raising men up in the congregation who can do that. So what are they supposed to do? Verses 10 through 16 of chapter 1 says they are to protect the church. Protect it doctrinally, protect it morally as well. Again, Paul warns Titus that these Cretans are drunken gluttons, he calls them, and he's quoting a Cretan who's saying that, and he's warning them against these moral issues, but also against doctrinal issues. That's what elders are supposed to be able to do, and in fact what they're supposed to do. Next, they're supposed to establish ministries in chapter 2. And there's a number of ministries listed there. Ministry to older men, older women. Ministry to younger women, younger men. Ministry to slaves, or what we would say workers today. The core of this ministry is teaching. They need to be taught. They need to be taught doctrine, and they need to be taught how to live a Christian life. So there's this ethical or moral aspect as well. And then finally, chapter 3 is about evangelism. So a church is to have qualified elders. The church is supposed to, sorry, I should mute this. Well, we'll just let that go. Church is supposed to have qualified elders. It's supposed to have qualified ministry. This is Jesus' directive to the church. And finally, evangelism. The evangelism begins with respect to the governing authorities. That is the local authorities, the local government. That the people of the church need to be respectful of the culture and the government that rules it. This is important today. You know, we've been quite politicized in the United States by every situation. And there's a way in our government to respectfully disagree. But the key thing there is respectfully. And that's what Paul's talking about. We need to respect the government and express that respect. Finally, in verses 3 through 7, our evangelism is based in God's grace, and we need to remember that God's grace has been extended to us as well. So often we become Christians and we begin to look down our noses at others who we regard sinners or threats because of their sinfulness, forgetting the fact that we've all been forgiven as well, and that we need to extend forgiveness to others. And then finally in verses 8 through 11 is an exhortation to do good. That we do good to each other primarily according to Galatians 6, but also to those outside the church as well. So we should be looking for opportunities for good works among ourselves as well as in our community, to outreach and to offer a community, Christian love and fellowship. Finally, Philemon. Philemon is a book about forgiveness, a book about forgiveness among Christian brothers. Philemon himself, so you know everyone involved here, is a wealthy businessman who hosted a church in his home. He seems to be the leader of the church. His wife is Apphia. His son is Escapus. Onesimus is a slave who has run away. And Paul is appealing to Philemon to forgive Onesimus, who has run to Paul, has found Paul, and has become a believer. So now he's not just a slave, but he's a brother. And Paul appeals to him. In verses 4 through 7, we see Paul's character on display, of a character that is forgiving, one that's thankful, appreciative, and Christ-centered. That's a forgiving character. Then these forgiving actions in verses 8 to 18, and Paul has a series of things that he wants Philemon to do. And then finally, this motivation to forgiveness, starting in verse 19 and going through 24. That motivation is ministry or unity first, unity in the body, unity in that house church, and then the expansion of ministry in that church. Paul says that he's confident Philemon's going to do even more. Exactly what that even more is, we're not sure. Could be to welcome Philemon as a returning prodigal son, so welcome him enthusiastically, welcome him with great fanfare and love. Could be that allowing Philemon or Onesimus to participate in the spiritual ministry of the church, not just a going back to being a slave, but now being a brother and a contributor and using his gift in the church. And finally, it could mean that Philemon is to go beyond forgiving just Onesimus and forgive others who have wronged him. So we don't know for sure, but we do know from church history that Onesimus later became a very prominent church leader in the first century church. So it looks like he was freed as a slave. His spiritual gifts were developed and proven in ministry, and he was elevated to place of leadership in the first century church. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. Enjoy your reading of Titus and Philemon today. Spiritual lessons I would give you is that, Titus tells us the whole community's watching us. The whole community has their eye on us. If we have leaders, if we have pastors and elders who are reproachful, who are not above accusation, the community knows it, and it damages and inhibits not only our witness, but it saddens the Lord to have people like that involved in bringing disparagement and accusation against His church. And then finally, also from Titus, God's word applies to everybody, right? We saw age-based, gender-based, occupation-based ministry there. It applies to everyone. And within the church, we need to be helping people apply God's word to their lives. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. Enjoy your reading today.